I am recording this short lecture meeting. And so we still have a little bit of the end of Chapter 4 Notes Part 1 to finish. And we will finish Chapter 4 Part 1 Notes on Monday, October 26th, first part of that class. But to get you ready for the Molecular Shapes Lab this week, we're going to jump a little bit ahead to Chapter 4 Notes Part 2 and talk about molecular shapes today. And so in Part 1 of the notes, we talked about the carbon cycle, and there were certain reservoirs where molecules containing carbon where they are stored, such as the atmosphere, such as in minerals and rocks and the ocean and surface water, as well as in plants and animals that inhabit the earth. And so of all the radiation that's emitted by the sun, which of course includes infrared radiation, UV radiation, as well as visible light, all of that radiation that comes from the sun, 46% of it is absorbed by the earth. And of that 46%, 37% is re-emitted in the form of infrared radiation, which we call IR. So that means that of that 46% that is absorbed, 37% of it is re-emitted, or basically it goes back into the atmosphere and then is re-emitted back to the surface of the earth. And so you have that continuous cycling of IR radiation, and the IR radiation is the heat that you feel from the sun. That's what makes the sun's radiation feel warm, is the IR radiation. And this is very important because that recirculation, basically, of heat absorbed from the sun back into the atmosphere, and then some of it's re-emitted back to the surface of the earth, and then re-emitted back into the atmosphere. So that cycling of the heat back and forth is a great thing that we call the greenhouse effect. And this greenhouse effect gives the earth an average temperature of about 15 degrees Celsius. And that keeps the earth warm enough to sustain life. Without this balance going back and forth between the earth and the atmosphere of this IR radiation, which is heat, and if we didn't have this natural balance, the average temperature of the earth would be much colder, about a negative 8 degrees Celsius, which is too cold to sustain life on earth as we know it. And so this graphic shows us the electromagnetic radiation, IR, visible, and UV, that comes from the sun. And we see that 23% of the 100% is absorbed directly by the atmosphere. And like we said, 46% of it hits the Earth's surface. The other 25% is reflected from the atmosphere. And then we also have 6% is reflected from the surface of the earth. And then of this 46% that gets absorbed, some of it is emitted back into the atmosphere from the earth's surface. Some goes into outer space, and some gets absorbed by the gases in the atmosphere. And so you have this continuous cycling of this IR radiation from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere, and then getting re-emitted back to the atmosphere, some of it that is absorbed directly by the Earth's surface. So it's this balance that keeps the Earth, both the surface and the atmosphere of the Earth, warm enough to sustain life on Earth as we know it. And so this amount here, this 37% of the total 100 that gets absorbed in the atmosphere. Well, how is it absorbed in the atmosphere? It's absorbed by what we call greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases. So warming by greenhouse gases, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Or is it a little of both? Well, yes, the last choice is the correct answer. It's a little of both. We need the greenhouse gases to trap the IR radiation in the atmosphere, and then it could be re-emitted back to the Earth's surface and then reabsorbed by the Earth's surface, re-emitted back to the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. We need that greenhouse effect to be in place to keep the Earth warm enough to sustain life on Earth as we know it. And so the IR radiation that's emitted by Earth back into the atmosphere is absorbed, like I stated, by those greenhouse gases or atmospheric gases, about 80% of it. And so absorption of this IR radiation by these atmospheric gases called greenhouse gases causes the bonds in these molecular gases like CO2 and methane, CH4. It causes the bonds in those molecules to vibrate. And the two types of vibrations that take place are bending vibrations and stretching vibrations. And so these atmospheric gases that have the ability to absorb and trap this IR radiation, which we call heat, are gases like CO2, water, and methane. Those are your three major ones. And the main one out of these three that absorbs IR radiation the best is CO2. Water is also very good at absorbing IR. We know that to be true from personal experience, right? And so it's no wonder that a lot of, also depending on other factors, but in tropical regions, islands, the water stays very, very warm, and that warm water helps keep the land next to it very warm as well, because water has a very high, what we call heat capacity. And we'll learn more about heat capacity in chapter 6, I do believe it is. And so having a high heat capacity means that a substance can hold on to heat. And so why does these molecules like carbon dioxide and water, why can they absorb heat, which we call IR, but other gases in our atmosphere like nitrogen, N2, and oxygen, they do not? Well, the ability to absorb IR radiation is going to depend on the shape of the molecule. And of course, that's the subject of our lab this week. So we have 4 pictures here, 4 molecular models And we looked at molecular models, pictures of molecular models during our Lewis structure lab a couple of weeks ago. And you're going to look at some more molecular model pictures this week in your molecular shapes lab. And so what we have here is water, carbon dioxide, and also oxygen and nitrogen. And we can see here that the shapes of CO2, O2, and N2 are very similar, whereas water's shape is totally different. And also notice that O2 and N2, which make up the majority of the air that we breathe, that these are diatomic molecules. Notice that they're composed of two of the same types of atoms. N2 is just two nitrogen atoms. O2 is just two oxygen atoms connected together. So diatomic molecules cannot absorb IR. So they can't trap heat. Even though these two molecules are very necessary in the air that we breathe. But as far as keeping the earth warm, they can't do that. CO2 and water, on the other hand, are not diatomic molecules. But because N2 and O2 are diatomic molecules, N2 has a triple bond in between the nitrogens. Oxygen has a double bond between the oxygen atoms. And because the N2 is two nitrogen atoms and the O2 is just two oxygen atoms, that means that this bond is what's called a non-polar bond. Same thing for the bond holding, the double bond holding the two oxygen atoms together. It's a non-polar bond. And that's why diatomic not absorb IR radiation. It's because their bonds in their molecular structure are non-polar. And we're going to talk more about polar versus non-polar a little bit later in the chapter. And we'll touch on that topic also in lab this week. And so notice H2O and CO2, unlike the diatomic molecules, they both have a central atom. And then two outside atoms connected to the central atom. So therefore, this OH bond in water is polar. And with CO2, you got a CO bond. That's a double bond. It's also polar because it's a bond connecting two atoms that are different from each other. Oxygen and carbon are different from each other. Oxygen and hydrogen are different from each other. So that's what makes the bond polar versus the N triple bond in nitrogen and the OO double bond in oxygen. That bond is composed of two of the same atoms, types of atoms. And so therefore, that's what makes those bonds nonpolar. So that's what explains why oxygen and nitrogen cannot absorb IR, because the bond holding those atoms together is nonpolar. Whereas CO2, water, those OH and CO bonds in those molecules are are polar bonds. So we talked about the greenhouse effect, the effect of these CO2 and water and methane molecules in our atmosphere being able to trap and hold on to heat and therefore keep our Earth at a temperature that's conducive to life as we know it. So the greenhouse effect is a natural effect. So we can define it as a natural process by which atmospheric gases like CO2 and water and methane, which we call greenhouse gases, they have the ability to trap a major portion of the IR radiation. And they trap about 80% of the IR radiation that's emitted by the sun. That the Earth absorbs and re-emits. So it has that they have the ability to trap the IR radiation. That's radiated by the Earth. So in other words, the Earth absorbs it and re-emits a portion of what it traps. And then the greenhouse gases in turn will trap about 80% of that. The other 20% will either go out into outer space or will bounce back to the Earth. So that's the greenhouse effect. So greenhouse gases are also called GHGs. They're gases that are capable of absorbing and emitting IR. And this process, of course, warms the Earth. So CO2, water, and methane fall under this category of greenhouse gases. And so when we put more CO2 in the atmosphere than would be normally there by the Earth's natural processes of respiration and photosynthesis and the absorption and evaporation of CO2 by our oceans and surface waters and that relationship with the atmosphere and that exchange between CO2, between the atmosphere and our surface and waters and oceans, that's all natural, just like photosynthesis and respiration are. But when we bring in human activities like burning fossil fuels and deforestation, we're putting more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere that would normally be there. And that's referred to as the enhanced greenhouse effect. So when there are more GHGs in the atmosphere, due to human activities, we trap more heat. And these human activities are often called anthropogenic influence. So how do we recognize a greenhouse gas? By shape and polarity. And that's going to be, of course, the subject of this week's lab. So we said oxygen and nitrogen are not greenhouse gases because they have nonpolar bonds. We said the greenhouse gases include methane, water, and carbon dioxide. So methane, we have the Lewis structure drawn here. And so we have 4 single CH bonds. Carbon and hydrogen are different from each other. They're not the same atom. And so therefore these bonds are polar. And we see that each hydrogen atom that's in the Lewis structure for methane has a bond angle, gives you a bond angle of 109.5 degrees. And so the valence shell electron pair repulsion theory, which we'll talk more about in lab this week, assumes that the most stable molecular shape of a molecule is going to be one in which the peripheral or outside atoms are as far apart from the central atom and each other as possible. So 4 electron pairs, like we see in methane, that are around the central carbon atom, are going to be far apart from each other as possible in an arrangement we call tetrahedral. So the tetrahedral shaped molecule, methane, having the bond angles of 109.5 degrees. So that is the molecular shape for methane and any other molecule that has a central atom that is bonded to 4 different outside atoms and is connected to those outside atoms via a bonding electron group, or either 2 electrons, which is a single bond, 4 electrons, which is a double, or 6, which is a triple. But as long as there are bonding electrons, and there are 4 bonding groups of electrons around that central atom, and when there are no lone pairs of electrons on that central atom, you're going to have the tetrahedral shape. But like methane having a tetrahedral shape, ammonia does not have a tetrahedral shape. Looking at the Lewis structure of ammonia, we see the central nitrogen has 3 bonding groups of electrons around it and 1 non-bonding group of electrons. So whenever you've got your central atom with 3 bonding groups and 1 non-bonding group, there's still 4 total groups of electrons around that central atom, but one of those 4 groups is non-bonding. That gives you the trigonal pyramid shape. So that's how ammonia's shape is different from methane's. The shape of water is considered bent because with the Lewis structure of water, you've got 2 bonding groups around the central atom and 2 non-bonding groups around the central atom. So there's total still 4 groups around the central atom, but 2 of those 4 groups are non-bonding, giving you the bent shape. And then finally, for carbon dioxide, its shape is linear. For carbon dioxide, it only has 2 bonding groups around that central carbon and no non-bonding groups. So whenever you have a central atom that's connected to just 2 bonding groups, there are no lone pairs, which we call non-bonding groups around that central atom, then your shape will always be linear. And so we're going to stop there. And this little graphic here, this table, tells you what your shape is going to be. And this is similar to the chart that we looked at in week 7, the Lewis Structure Lab, and that we'll look at this week in our shapes lab, molecular shapes lab, that if you have only 2 bonding groups and no lone pairs, which we call non-bonding groups, then like CO2, that molecule is going to have a linear shape. And then we also looked at the trigonal pyramid shape of ammonia, the tetrahedral shape of methane, and we looked at the bent shape of water with 2 bonding groups and 2 non-bonding groups. But if you have the situation where you got 3 bonding groups, and if you have 0 non-bonding groups, your shape is trigonal planar. And like ammonia, if you've got 3 bonding groups and 1 non-bonding group of lone pair of electrons on the central atom, your shape will be trigonal pyramid. So that kind of sets us up for this week's lab in talking about shapes. Again, when we resume class on Monday, we'll finish up the last part of chapter 4, part 1 notes, and then we'll jump back in part 2 and review what we learned in this week's lab about molecular shapes, and then we'll answer some questions concerning greenhouse gases and molecular shapes when we return to class on Monday. There will also be a part 3 for chapter 4 notes, and I will get that posted this weekend. So I anticipate us finishing up chapter 4 next week on Wednesday. We may have just a little bit of it that may spill over into the week of the 2nd, but we'll definitely be starting chapter 5 on November 2nd. And so have a good rest of your Wednesday. I am recording this, and I will post this recording on our eLearn site for you to refer back to if you need to.